The Victoria Memorial Hall. Welcome to all of you. It is lovely to see so many of you showing interest in Shakespeare in Bengal. And this evening's panel discussion has been organized in conjunction with an exhibition which is already on display in the central hall of the museum building here. And I suppose many of you have had the opportunity to go and have a look at the exhibition. And we have eminent panelists here. So without any further ado, I would hand over proceedings to Dr. Doyeeta Majumder, who would be steering proceedings from here on. But before she takes over, I would just like to request all of you, please put your mobile phones on silent or switch them off totally if you can, if you don't know how to put it on silent. Okay? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Raman, and thanks to VMH for letting us sort of co-hosting this event with us. As Mr. Raman said, this panel discussion is about this project Shakespeare in Bengal, and which has been housed at the Department of English, Jadavpur University. And we have I'll just introduce the panelists. We have Professor Paromita Chakravarti, who is the director of the project. We have Mr. Eric Jonson from Folger Shakespeare Library, the director of digital acquisitions. And we have Professor Emeritus Sukanta Chaudhuri from the Department of English, Jadavpur. And I hope that, as Mr. Raman said, that some of you have at least managed to see the exhibition. If not, it's on till Sunday. The exhibition showcases some of our findings from the Shakespeare in Bengal project, and which has been going on in the department for a few years. Over the last sort of 1 year, we've had this collaboration with Folger Shakespeare Library and their Global Shakespeare's project. And this event is also kind of doubling up as an inaugural event for another conference that is being hosted by the Department of English, which starts tomorrow, which is titled Renaissance Man, Reappraisal and Reinvention. 2019 marks the quincentenary of Leonardo da Vinci's death. And the conference sort of commemorates that, and we're trying to, the speakers would try to, the purpose of it is to try and reassess this whole idea of the Renaissance man and the ways in which it has been interpreted. So we're trying to kind of hope for some common ground with the Shakespeare in Bengal project as well. So I'll just start by asking Paromita to talk a little bit about the history of the Shakespeare in Bengal project and how it has shaped up over the last few years.
This is our first major public event to talk a little bit about a project which has actually been going on for 6 or 7 years now. And it's under, we as a department, we run a program which is, we've been awarded a program which is called Center for Advanced Studies, and it's under this, under the aegis of this that we've been pursuing this project. Under a sort of larger rubric of cultural transactions. And within, historically, there's been a lot of Shakespeare expertise in the department, as indeed there has been a lot of post-colonial scholars. So Shakespeare in Bengal seemed like a happy meeting ground for both kinds of scholars. So we put together a team and started this work. It's basically trying to archive material related to both colonial and post-colonial histories of negotiating with Shakespeare, Shakespearean play, Shakespearean texts in Bengal. Why Bengal? Because this was, of course, one of the places where colonial education started, and as a centerpiece of that education, Shakespeare teaching, we know about Hindu College and later Presidency College, and the traditions of Shakespeare teaching there, and how Shakespeare became a very, very important imperial tool to create a certain kind of native citizenry. And how Shakespeare was also very, very central to bringing in ideas at the same time. So while it was, a certain kind of colonial project going on through the teaching of Shakespeare, shaping a certain kind of particularly civil servant as Macaulay envisaged. But through the teaching of Shakespeare, there was also, I'm sure that the British did not intend this, but an unintentional fallout, which was a kind of introduction to Western ideas, to European ideas, Enlightenment ideas, Renaissance ideas, which created a certain kind of modern space for conversations, and which finally led perhaps to, as the introduction to many other Western texts did, to a certain notion of what we now call the Bengal Renaissance. So yes, this sort of very, very interesting place of Shakespeare in our pedagogies, and also, the response from performers, from actors, from directors, from playwrights who translated Shakespeare, put Shakespeare on stage, popular reception of Shakespeare. So there was a lot of very, very interesting things happening in Bengal. And around the same time, also in Maharashtra, I'm hoping somebody will take up a similar project in Maharashtra as well, because there are very interesting parallels, and as well as in South India. But in Bengal, it was where it all started, and where it flourished in a way which was quite unprecedented. And this is a continuing legacy of Shakespeare that we still have, and we are sort of, and it gives me great pleasure to see Kaushik Sen here, and he has staged a very, very interesting production of Macbeth in recent times. Well, not that recent, but 5 or 6 years ago, 2012. Which we saw with great interest. So this is, and particularly around 2014 and 15, 2014 till 16, I think these 2 years were particularly fertile as far as Shakespeare films were concerned. And perhaps one of the reasons was because these were the 2 years when, the 400th death anniversary of Shakespeare and the 450th birth anniversary of Shakespeare also sort of fell around that time. And we have a series of Bengali films, a spurt of Bengali films around Shakespeare plays. Again, Kaushik was in one of them, Zulfikar, which Srijit Mukherjee made, Arshinagar, Hemonto. So there was a series of films as well. So it's a continuing sort of engagement with Shakespeare. So it's not just a sort of colonial legacy that we are talking about. It's also kind of post-colonial writing back, post-colonial negotiation with an author who has been much more than an author. He has been a sort of cultural icon in many ways, representing not just high culture, but also popular cultural manifestations. So for instance, Utpal Datta famously sort of used Shakespeare to produce Jatra. So it provides this very, very interesting site. I think Shakespearean negotiations in Bengal provide a very interesting site for cultural studies and to look at the cultural history of Bengal itself. And so it's not just about Shakespeare, but also to look at this larger history and our sort of connections with it. So I think I'll just stop there, and yeah, I think I've spoken a lot. Take a breather.
Thank you. I'll just sort of try and sort of get Eric into this discussion and ask you about the recent collaboration with Jadavpur and what is happening at Folger, the Global Shakespeare's project, and why, how this collaboration kind of shaped up, if you would like to say.
Sure. Well, I should probably start by talking about the Folger Shakespeare Library, since you all have no doubt heard of Shakespeare since you're here this evening, but maybe not the Folger Shakespeare Library. So we are located in Washington, D.C., and not only are we in the Capitol, we're 2 blocks away from the Capitol building, amongst the Library of Congress and across an intersection from our Supreme Court. So the Folger looks like a government building, but it's actually not. We're a private institution that was founded a little bit less than a century ago by Henry Clay and Emily Folger. Henry and Emily did not have children, but they had a decent amount of money because Henry, although he came from modest means, was part of was one of the executives of the Standard Oil Corporation in the United States. And because they didn't have children, they couldn't leave them a legacy, so they collected books, particularly Shakespeare. During their lifetimes, they amassed the greatest collection of early printed Shakespeare works in the world. So if you want to see the earliest editions of Shakespeare, you don't go to the United Kingdom, you go to Washington and you request them from our vault. So the Folger has an interesting history in that. We've taken a lot from Shakespeare's home and made them available for researchers. And the Folger really has two main parts of its mission, and it tracks along with its collection. The first is to promote the study of early modern European culture, particularly in Great Britain, and also everything having to do with Shakespeare from Shakespeare's day to the present day. So that is what we collect. We continue to buy early modern books, and we continue to acquire materials related to Shakespeare from around the world. We also publish things. My role at the Folger is both to do digital publishing, so oversee our digital infrastructure and what we publish online. We reach millions of people that way, including many people in India. Also, we publish traditional books, so printed books, e-books, and books in other media. And we've got one of the most popular Shakespeare sites that exist. And we have been interested in expanding our global holdings. It is often easier to collect Western materials. It's also something we've been doing for many decades. But we also want to expand our reach, our mission, more strongly into other parts of the world, particularly given that that the barriers for doing so are so low in the world today. So you can't start with the world. You can start with parts of the world. And partnering with Jadavpur has made a lot of sense to talk about the story of Shakespeare in Bengal. We are currently, we've done a number of activities, including documenting a list of theatrical productions in Bengal. Also, we have worked to create a website called Shakespeare in Bengal, which is linked to a platform that we've just built to do online publishing. And so it is not a comprehensive website that tells the entire story. That story has been told elsewhere, but it's an introduction, and it shows highlights and features with multimedia, so images and well, I guess mainly images, showing the impact of Shakespeare in Bengal. And we were hoping that this experiment will be seen as valuable in itself, and that we can then do this for other parts, perhaps other parts of the subcontinent, certainly other regions of the world where Shakespeare has made an impact. And is for that reason that I'm visiting India for the second time today. 3 years ago, we had discussions to help get this started, and now it is proceeding at a pace. And very grateful for you all for coming and for your interest in this.
Thank you, Eric. Paromita, they began by talking about the importance of, why Bengal, why particularly Shakespeare in Bengal, and she spoke a little bit about the stage, the sort of, nearly 2 century long kind of history of Shakespeare on the Bengali stage. And if Sukanta would like to talk about the early theatrical history of Shakespearean plays and adaptations.
That's right. I can hear myself. Actually, maybe I won't just talk about the early stage, but I'll go back one step and talk about what I think might be a good way to kind of marshal the rest of our discussion together, which is this rather unusual circumstance. Now, certainly, probably even in the Anglophone countries, and certainly outside the Anglophone countries, far more people read Shakespeare than have the opportunity to see Shakespeare on the stage. even in adaptations in local languages and local theatrical traditions, let alone in the original English. But rather, maybe unusually, in Kolkata, from the late 18th century onwards, there was this great deal of performance of Shakespeare, originally for the British residents of Kolkata, but gradually spreading to at least the wealthy elite Bengalis. And this was already there when the study of English, and hence the study of Shakespeare, which loomed very large in that program, began again at the fag end of the 18th century or the 19th century. See, even before the foundation of the Hindu College, there were a number of private institutions. And in fact, the first record we have of Indian actors, amateur actors, students performing Shakespeare is in fact from a record of when it happened in the very early years of the 19th century in Drummond's Dharamtala Academy. See. So very unusually, when people began reading Shakespeare, they already had in their own city, whether or not many of them were regularly attending them, they knew that there was a strong performative tradition of Shakespeare already sort of there on the same site, as it were. And this meant that you find that apart from the touring British companies and the companies of local English theatre, which were formed in Kolkata as a result, you have students acting Shakespeare who were at the same time reading Shakespeare in the classroom. Then either those students, when they grew up, or if they happened to have read, acquired a knowledge of English and read Shakespeare themselves, see, the Bengali elite began performing Shakespeare at their own homes or other cultural venues. And this could act as a foundation for the entry of Shakespeare into commercial Bengali theatre from roughly the middle of the 19th century. And this sort of traffic between the study of Shakespeare's texts and the performance of Shakespeare, I think that's interesting. I mean, there are just a few names here. I mean, among people that we think of as writers or scholars, beginning with Derozio, Krishnamohan Bandyopadhyay, Ramtanu Lahiri, Michael Madhusudan Datta, Rajendra Lal Mitra, Keshav Chandra Sen, Shuniti Chatterjee, maybe more unusually Rajendra Prasad, who was a student at Calcutta, of course, and later on, of course, became President of India. They all acted in Shakespeare. Whereas on the other side, if you think of the eminent theatre persons and theatre managers and organizers and actors, you find that many of them were also very fine Shakespeareans. To take just the three outstanding examples from three generations. Girish Chandra Ghosh, he was a very profound Shakespearean scholar in the true sense. Shishir Kumar Bhaduri, of course, was himself a teacher of literature before he turned to the stage. And then Utpal Datta, who has produced what I think I would certainly consider the finest work of Shakespearean criticism in Bengali that has been produced so far, Shakespearean Samachetana. So there is this constant interaction, but there is also a kind of independent line being traced by the theatrical tradition and the academic and pedagogic tradition. And this shows in an interesting way. I'll just cite this example and then I'll end this round of my what I have to say, which is that if you look at the history of Shakespearean productions in Bengal, in Bengali actually, you find that up to the early years of the 20th century, there is a regular steady flow of new productions, which abruptly ends around 1920 and does not resume at all till well after independence. For roughly 30 years, from 1920 to 1950, there are practically no Shakespeare productions in Bengali to speak of. At the same time, the academic study of Bengal, of Shakespeare in Bengal, was flourishing. I mean, large numbers of students were reading Shakespeare both in special English courses, honors courses, master's courses, and as a component of other courses to an extent that we could hardly imagine now. And an interesting example of this is maybe another nugget I can quote, is that the most substantial work of Shakespeare criticism produced by any Bengali scholar before independence, and indeed one of the most substantial to date, was not produced by a literary scholar. It was produced by the man who was and is in history one of India's foremost scientists, Prafulla Chandra Rai. He wrote a series of articles for the Calcutta Review under the generic title, The Shakespeare Puzzle. And one is amazed to see how much he had read, not only of Shakespeare, but of Shakespeare criticism. Precisely what the puzzle was that he's trying to solve, I must say, remains a bit of a puzzle itself. But it seems to be the fact that, see, as I said, he's a scientist of gigantic stature and also an entrepreneur who tried to set up industry in Bengal, in India, on scientific models. So he could not carry out deep research into Shakespeare himself. He relied very largely on the researchers of the time by professional scholars, academic scholars. And he, to some extent, swallowed this idea that the theatre in Shakespeare's day was held in scorn, was treated with contempt, and that generally the dramatists were people of little education and they weren't appreciated at all. So in such a situation, how did this supreme genius come to appear and express himself and leave his mark? I think that, as far as I'm able to make out, is a puzzle. But the fact that, okay, Prafulla Chandra was an outstanding man, but that but he was also a child of his times. I mean, there was this amount of the study of Shakespeare being carried out generally in educated Bengali society at the time. So, and yet there was this big gap in the theatrical history over these 30 years. The nearest I've been able to come up with as an explanation is that it may have something to do with the independence movement. It was thought kind of vaguely unpatriotic to perform an English dramatist on stage, or even as adaptations. Whereas, down a different line, to serve as kind of academic compradors and study Shakespeare was thought perfectly acceptable. But anyway, I think I've already talked long enough this time round, so
I just want to respond to what you were saying, because for me, again, a very interesting aspect of Shakespearean studies and Shakespeare-related activities in Bengal is this sort of a kind of, very easy traffic between performances and textual studies, which now has become, probably is not perhaps as closely related as it used to be. And even, the accounts and those few who've visited the exhibition, we've tried to showcase some of this. Because even when people are talking about Shakespeare teaching, when they're talking about classroom teaching, they are really talking about extremely performative teachers who are, sort of, and part of, what students were expected to do was to put up Shakespeare performances in school, as Sukanta was saying, in the Oriental Seminary, which Tagore attended, in the Dharamtala Academy that Sukanta mentioned, as again, part of the 16th century humanist education, again, theatricals were supposed to be part of education, and elocution, to be able to, dramatically sort of recite speeches out of Shakespeare. So for instance, Portia's speech in the trial scene would be one of the favorites, and students would be encouraged to memorize it. Even now in schools, I mean, this is part of sort of extracurricular activities where, students have elocution contests where or lines from Julius Caesar, for instance, they seem to be the most popular sort of school texts. And so again, this sort of performativity in classrooms, a certain kind of interest in, and also teaching as performance, and which I think all of us engage in to a certain extent. But legendary teachers like D.L. Richardson, for instance, and later on in the day, I've been taught by Jyotibhushan Bhattacharya. They used to perform Shakespeare in class, and that was part of the pedagogic tradition. So what is very interesting for me is to look at, for instance, Sukanta was talking about the 19th century, to look at accounts, memoirs of students recalling their teachers, early teachers in Hindu College, for instance. I just mentioned D.L. Richardson. About him, it was said that, he, in Bangla, I mean, when Shivnath Shastri recollects, or is talking in his Ramtanur Lahirir, in that text, when he's talking about D.L. Richardson, he's described as unmotto, as mad. And the words that are constantly used in the context of Shakespeare teaching is, it's like a frenzy, intoxication, it's like an addiction. So it is almost like a sort of ecstatic performance. And even when Tagore is writing about Okhachandra, who initiated him into Shakespeare, he is using words like, when he translates Jivan Smriti, he's using words like frenzy, fury, passion. So extraordinary levels of both physical and psychological engagement in the text, which is really almost like a performance. So for me, that is a very, very distinctive aspect, I think, of Shakespearean pedagogy, and its sort of interface with performance. And one of the things that we were trying to do in this archive was actually to collect, because there are many, many memoirs which are sort of largely 19th century or early 20th century of people recalling their Shakespeare teachers. Because one of the things that a lot of people just tell us is, oh, we don't know, we just love Shakespeare. So, again, we were trying to sort of unpack a little bit of, what this actually means. What does it mean if you were to put it in some kind of critical theoretical frame? One of the things that we undertook, and I'm very glad that we actually did it, was to interview people from very diverse backgrounds, very diverse institutional backgrounds, so different kinds of colleges and universities, and just ask them to talk about their Shakespeare classes, both in school and in college or at university. And we've collected about 60 oral narratives, which give us almost as, and we've interviewed people, who have been talking about people like, in presidency, Taraknath Sen was a legendary teacher, Shoilen Sen, and others. And we also have, much more recent experiences of people who talk about Sukanta, for instance. If I were to be interviewed, I would actually talk about him and his As You Like It classes. So it's sort of, a generational sort of study of also how Shakespeare pedagogy has changed, evolved, and particularly sort of its connections with performance as well. Because I think that tradition of the very deep connection of performance with text, we've lost a little bit. I mean, it's a much more sort of critical textual engagement that we have now. So again, I would really like to highlight the fact that one of the interesting aspects, and the findings of the project are online, so you can go and read many of these accounts of people talking about Shakespeare in class, and it's sort of wide range, it's sort of freewheeling interviews that we did, and people talk about a wide range of issues. For instance, the problem of how do you talk about Shakespeare's sexual innuendos. How do you talk about it in class? And I think this was a problem, which D.L. Richardson also had, when he was teaching the sonnets, and he said, "I wish Shakespeare hadn't written the phrase, the master mistress of my passions." It's almost impossible to explain this. And I think, teachers down the line have had this problem, and, editors like Verity have expunged, bowdlerized Shakespeare, but I think this continues to be, and what you do with expletives, what you do with things that you don't really want to talk about, but Shakespeare talks about incessantly. So again, I think it is a pedagogic problem. It's not just a moral issue. So things like that. So I think people might find that interesting. So I just wanted to.
Thanks. I joined the project a bit late in the day, but for me also, I think this pedagogic strand was one of the most kind of fascinating findings of the project itself. If for those of you who've seen the exhibition, there is also a section, and as Paromita said in her kind of first, when she was speaking initially, that over the last, I think 2014 to 16, you were saying that there's this resurgence in film, in Shakespeare non-Indian film, and in Bengali film. You've also, yeah. Would you like? You've also recently written a book on that. So would you like to talk about Shakespeare on film a bit?
I've just spoken. You're supposed to pass the baton round. No. I think it was interesting that we had a spurt of, because it's, in the 60s we have films like Shoptapodi, for instance, and we have Bhranti Bilash, which is based on Shakespeare's Comedy of Errors. And in fact, Shakespeare's Comedy of Errors is perhaps the most performed play, if I'm not wrong, and it is definitely the most filmed of Shakespeare's plays, if you look at Indian cinema. And, again, it's interesting to think about why culturally we are so drawn to this idea of mistaken identities and multiple twins. What is it in our culture? And there's been a lot of sort of theorizing around it, why we like Comedy of Errors so much. And it is a sort of crazy play. It is very, very difficult to perform because, it's difficult to have identical twins. It's difficult to, I don't know, how you would actually perform when people look very different and pretend that, people can't even tell the difference between them. In cinema, of course, it's easier because, and I think cinema was actually responding to the fact, and it chose Comedy of Errors to showcase how well it could deal with things like, for instance, doubling of roles. And in cinema, of course, you could do that, and many scholars have said that this was a way of, amplifying star power. You choose one star, make him perform two roles. So, of course, in Bhranti Bilash, you have Uttam Kumar playing the main twin, and of course, he's playing two roles. I mean, so you give him probably the salary of one person, and so this is, similarly in the Hindi version, you have Kishore Kumar playing two roles. So you choose these characters and you make them work very hard. And I think cinema was very interested in showcasing one of these things. And it was also very interesting because cinematic technique, of course, allows you, ways of doubling, which, of course, performance doesn't, or theatre performance doesn't. So, and there is this whole idea that as Indians, we believe in reincarnation, we believe in multiple selves, we believe in, performing identities, etc., etc. So I'm not going into all of that, but for some reason or the other, there's some kind of deep cultural reason why we love Comedy of Errors. So Bhranti Bilash, which was translated in 1869 as a prose romance by Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, again, unlikely, but he was, and he said, Dom Phata Hashir Golpo. And so Dom Phata Hashir Golpo, which then gets 100 years later, in 1961 becomes, again, a very, very popular Uttam Kumar starrer as Bhranti Bilash. And then earlier, actually, so Bhranti Bilash is 1963, Monu Sen directed it. And 1961 is, of course, Shoptapodi, which I think is a very, very interesting film, which doesn't really get noticed. And what I find remarkable about a film like that is it's not a Shakespeare film, but it has 15 minutes of Shakespeare performed in the original language in it. And it was a very popular cinema, continues to be popular. So, and of course there you can hear Utpal Datta's voice, you know, as indeed Uttam Kumar is performing the role. So, Rituparna Ghosh had once actually said this in an interview, that it was a time in cinema, it was a heady time in cinema, where in a popular film, you could have, you know, 15 minutes of straight Shakespeare in Shakespearean English, and people would actually sit and watch it and love the film for it. And we've lost that moment. And audiences have been split in a way that, you know, now you can't do that. Maybe you can do it in a sort of quote unquote art house movie. You can't actually do it in a commercial popular film anymore. So for me, that's a very, very interesting moment also in Bengali film history and its association with Shakespeare. There has been a huge sort of gap after the 60s, you know, and I think part of it is because in the 80s there was this split in audiences that I'm talking about, where you have a certain kind of commercial Bengali cinema which probably the middle class wouldn't go and watch, and you have a certain kind of middle class cinema coming into existence, you know, this sort of drawing room kind of cinema, which is, you know, Rituparna Ghosh, Aparna Sen, etc. They pioneered it, which is again a very different kind of cinema, which probably ordinary people which is not popular cinema, clearly. So that split, I think, made Shakespeare very difficult, a very difficult author to approach. But from the 2000s onwards, of course, in 2001, we had that extraordinary Srimati Bhayankari, which is The Taming of the Shrew with Shatabdi, yes, as Catherine. Very extraordinary. Because it is sort of within the context of popular cinema. And of course, it was a very popular drama, popular stage performance in the 80s with Robi Ghosh and Bashu Binondi and others. And it's sort of showcased in our exhibition if you're interested. So that is an odd cinema, and it sort of stands out a little bit. And then in 2006, I think you had Rituparna Ghosh's Last Lear, where he's, again, he's trying to engage with Shakespeare's Lear through actually Utpal Datta's Ajke Shah Jahan. So it's a complex kind of narrative. But suddenly, as I said, between 2014 and 16, we had a spurt of Bengali films on Shakespeare. And I think it was like a bonanza in many ways. I mean, it started, I think, with Rid Majhare by Ranjan Ghosh, who was using several sort of Shakespeare narratives. But I think, again, Arshinagar, Eric has to respond to this because he's just met Aparna Sen. So Aparna Sen's Arshinagar, and in 2016 there was Zulfikar by Srijit Mukherjee and Anjan Datta's Hemonto, which is based on Hamlet. So I think we probably need to understand, and it's also very interesting because these films are also showcasing a very different kind of city. Zulfikar definitely is. It's not a city, and Arshinagar, of course, is very stylized, based on West Side Story, taking the Romeo Juliet plot and sort of it's almost like a theatrical set where it's set. So it's really trying to combine theater and cinema in very, very interesting ways. So I mean, those of you who haven't watched it, to endlessly talk about it is boring. So I think it's more interesting if Eric says a little bit about his encounter with him.
Sure. Well, it was a very recent encounter with Aparna Sen.
And you have seen the film, right?
I have seen the film. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
So we really want to hear from you.
Every DVD is Bengali Shakespeare.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, and I should say, and this is not necessarily directly related to Shakespeare, that I've become a devotee of Bollywood movies, and we can actually get a lot of them in the States now, but through streaming. What is lacking sometimes is the more art house movies. But like anything that has Shah Rukh Khan or Salman Khan comes directly to the United States within 6 months. But there's an expanding list of titles, including non-Hindi movies that come in. And I was able to stream Shinagar in my own house and watch it with my wife. So that was wonderful. But one of the things that I think is fascinating about talking to both Apprentice and also anyone who's involved with making Shakespeare popular is that if it has to do with a movie or a theatrical production, you're essentially placing a bet. You're placing a bet of time and money and people's efforts and trying to get people to be involved with it. To talk to her about the different ways in which she was able to execute a creative vision of a Romeo and Juliet adaptation in a way that was going to interest people in the kinds of things that she wanted to do with the film, which I personally thought was fascinating because in Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, the backdrop is the communal problems that the two warring families cause. And then but the foreground is the love story, and then Ashinagar, the love story is interwoven among what is foregrounded, which is the battle for this town, so I think that's thinking in terms of adaptations is probably something that is. I wouldn't say it's something that in the U.S., UK, Canada, it's not something that it's seen as secondary with Shakespeare. What is primary is teaching the texts of Shakespeare and trying to figure out a way to make that palatable. But one of the things that the Folger has tried to do is, as Paromita was just describing, so the Folger has an education division where we train teachers to teach Shakespeare. We've trained thousands of English teachers, just regular secondary school teachers, how to teach Shakespeare. And we have found that, not surprisingly, the best way to get people involved with Shakespeare and to get them to connect to it is to perform it in classrooms, just in the same way that Paromita was just describing. So not only did that work historically, that works today, at least from what we have seen. For us, that's very important for a couple of reasons. First is because Shakespeare is part of our mission. The other is that we want to create what we call Shakespeare enthusiasts who are who want to go see a Shakespeare play or movie or read about Shakespeare on their own when they're not being compelled to by a class assignment. The metaphor that I've used, that I use in the United States, is with baseball. Maybe I could use cricket here. But in the United States, the Professional Baseball Association subsidizes baseball at all levels, down to children playing baseball, because they want to make sure that when they grow to be adults, that they're baseball fans. They go and see games and follow teams, and that they understand the game. That's what we want to do with Shakespeare. In order to do that, getting them to play the game, getting them to perform, is really the best way to do that. There's something about not just seeing it, but also vocalizing it. So yeah, talking to Aparna more about how to make things relevant and connected, I think was certainly a fascinating experience.
Would you tell us a little bit about the film collections at Folgers, taking up on that discussion surrounding film? And, we were talking about non-Anglophone encounters with Shakespeare, so plans of building non-Anglophone film archives or...
Sure. So we've collected, we will collect, like I say, anything having to do with Shakespeare to the present day. There's kind of a fuzzy line between what is Shakespeare and what is not Shakespeare. Just because something quotes Shakespeare doesn't make it Shakespeare. If, as you say, there's a 15-minute performance of Shakespeare in a movie, that probably would qualify. And we do collect adaptations, but If there's a plot that was just inspired by Romeo and Juliet, does that count? If there's something that has Shakespearean elements, does that count? So there's a certain amount of subjectivity when it comes to collecting. One of the reasons that we have not collected movies as much, or other media other than books, is just because up until recently it's been very difficult to find out about them, and if we find out about them, to acquire them. And also, once they're acquired, it's difficult to preserve. We think of DVDs as being something that's very durable because you could take out a DVD from 10 years ago, and as long as it hasn't been damaged, you can play it. But DVDs are becoming obsolete. Streaming is becoming much more prominent, and indeed, physical media for delivering movies might die out. That might seem like a technical consideration, but if you want to collect something that other people can watch, then it becomes more of a technical issue, because then we have to, store the movies electronically, and so it is a little bit more further afield. But it is something that it is a single problem that can be applied to many different things. I should say also, we have an ongoing project called World Shakespeare Bibliography, where we have contributors from all around the world. It's exactly what it sounds like. We have contributors all around the world who are collecting information about not just Shakespeare-related publications, but more popular things like movies. You even have things like comic books. Like we have Japanese manga comic books that are Shakespearean that we've cataloged. And so yes, be more deliberate, I would say, about collecting this this material is something we're interested in. The final bit I would say about the challenge is that even though movies are designed for a popular audience, copyright laws are not. So we can collect all this material, and if you want, yes, well-known problem. So we can collect all this material, and we can put it in our vault in Washington D.C. And if you can manage to make it to Washington, we'll show you anything we have. But it's difficult to get there, and it's difficult once you get there to be able to stay very long, as it's an expensive city. So trying to figure out some way to collect these materials and make them available. Well, I guess to an extent it's true for all of our materials, but particularly true for digital media too. So.
Thanks. That's something, copyright issues and stuff like that, it's something we have been grappling with our archive as well. If I may, I'd just like to bring the discussion back to the exhibition which is going on, and if Chaudhuri, who has put together heroically the exhibition, if she would like to speak a little bit about the specific challenges and problems, I think.
And which also has to do with the challenges of the archive. As well.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think one of the biggest challenges we faced while curating the exhibition was what do we leave out of it. And something we settled on pretty early on was to restrict our material to the most visually striking content that we have. And we weren't happy about the decision, but it had to be made, because we also wanted to keep in mind the footfall expected, the architecture of the gallery, and a question that we received earlier this evening was, why did you, for instance, omit the many title pages of 19th century publications on Shakespeare, and that's exactly why. Another big challenge we faced was showcasing audiovisual material, one being copyright issues. So if we are only allowed to, say, show 30 seconds of a clip of a film, and it's shown in a gallery, and it's running without audio, so you just have the transcript or the subtitle running with it, it's very difficult to gauge or understand the Shakespearean impact from decontextualized in a 30-second clip. So that is something we had to also leave aside. Perhaps for a different kind of exhibition, we may want to keep that in mind. And the third issue, I think, was choosing not to make the exhibition an interactive one. A lot of our material, especially interviews with academicians or theatre personalities, when they talk about their engagement with Shakespeare in school, consisted of them talking about or reciting excerpts from their classrooms, and a lot of the charm and the fun of it is in hearing that happen. So providing a transcript of those interviews kind of lost a bit of the plot. So we chose not to leave that, and recently we had the opportunity to collaborate with Natyashod Shanstan, which is an archive of theatre productions, and we have a large amount of data collected from there about Shakespeare productions in Bengal. And the question is, how does one host data like that to make it appeal to an audience that is perhaps spending 15 minutes at an exhibition in the Central Hall? And one way of doing it is mapping it digitally. And there's softwares for that, where you map the data that you have, the year, the director, the play that has been adapted. And when you map it, you instantly, at a glance, can see which year or which year certain productions were preferred over others, what a specific decade throws up at you, which theatre, produced which film, which play. So that needs an interactive exhibition and a whole other planning, which we had to settle on a more analog, static exhibition for now, and we are considering this to be a sample platter of what the archive has. There's a lot of material. The archive is very rich. We can, maybe, I'm just putting it out there, think of this as step one of other exhibitions to come that can be more digitally attuned and showcase the material better. So those were some of the challenges that we faced.
I think it was very important for us to have the exhibition in the rotunda of Victoria Memorial, because it's such an iconic space. So it came with its own problems, and it's a space which is continuously where people are milling around talking. So you can't really have much audio content there. But at the same time, I think just the impact of the material which has to do with Shakespeare in Bengal in the rotunda of Victoria Memorial itself, I think, is interesting and important. So.
Thanks. One of the other things, I think this was Shudagati's idea, which again, the problem was the interactive digital bit that we couldn't install, was to map a digital kind of portrait of a timeline of the productions, Shakespearean productions in Bengal, from
also the theatre districts.
Yeah. So map on the time.
Yeah, map of the city. And
yes. So maybe
next time.
Yes. And sort of bringing the discussion back to then stage and theatre, and Sukanta, would you like to? You were talking about that gap that happened, the 30-year gap, and then that sort of. And what after? So would you like to talk about the post-independence theatrical trends? Or yes.
Okay. Thank you, Doyeeta. Actually, there are a couple of just sort of anecdotal kind of snippets which I'd like to sort of offer to you first, which is when Paromita was talking about that old kind of emotional theatrical tradition of turning the classroom into a stage, as it were, this histrionic tradition of pedagogy, which was and to some extent still is very much in evidence in our country. But I remember a story I heard from my parents, who were the students of another of the legendary Shakespearean professors, Prafulla Chandra Ghosh. I used to teach them Othello, and when he reached the scene where Othello slaps Desdemona, he would burst into tears. And this, I remember, I heard the story when I was myself a schoolboy, and struck with rather irreverent thought that if he had to teach this play year after year, as sadly we have to do, did he every year burst into tears at that particular point of time? And if so, did it rather take away from the spontaneity of the exercise? And later on, when I was going through certain archives of the English department of Presidency College, stories about archives rather, earlier, I mean, the guru of Prafulla Chandra Ghosh was Hugh Melville Percival, Hugh Haddington, H.M. Percival, Hugh Melville Percival, yes, who, despite his name, was very much an Indian. He came from Chittagong, and he done a number of editions of some Shakespearean plays, which you will find in his name, which may be looked at more often than they are these days. But he didn't actually prepare those editions. They were prepared by his students from the lecture notes they'd taken in his classes. And apparently the lecture notes of As You Like It, which were used for the purpose, the sort of the admiring student had actually noted at one point, here Professor Percival laughed. So, another snippet of different kind, which is something, a very perceptive comment made by Oponda Shin when Eric and I went to see her this afternoon, which is that she too has another Shakespearean play, which is not a Shakespearean play, not quite like Shoptapati, but the proportions are like that, which is 36 Chorungi Lane, where you have these two teachers. I mean, there's the central character of the play, who's in fact a very bad teacher of Shakespeare, as Oponda Shin just reminded us. And she teaches Shakespeare in the tireless, listless way, probably from Verity's edition, and explaining the meanings of the world, and the children yawn. And she's replaced and sent to teach grammar to a class of younger children, and the teacher who replaces her brings along a model of the Globe Theatre and gets the students to act scenes from the 12th night out of this classroom, and obviously that's a much better idea. Anyway, about the theatre, I mean, I just say a little bit. Now, the point I would like to make about the early history of Shakespearean Bengali theatre through the 19th, in the later half of the 19th and the first decade or two of the 20th century. Maybe the last major production of the sort was one in 1919 of Othello. But I was struck, I was reminded of all this by a remark that Eric made about how you define a Shakespearean product or artifact, as it were. Because, see, and when in fact we were doing our library research to provide material for the Folger Shakespeare Libraries project, which plays do we take? Which plays do we even know are worth taking? There are a relatively small number of plays which are clearly translations of Shakespeare or closely based on Shakespeare, and a surprising number which are prose paraphrases of Shakespeare. Beyond that, there are a number of plays which are easy to recognize as Shakespearean, although the story has been completely Indianized, new characters might have been added, and all kinds of embellishments put in, including songs, for instance. But it is still recognizably an adaptation of a Shakespeare play. But from that, gradually you pass through through degrees of Shakespearean presence, as it were, to plays which contain nothing Shakespearean. There might not be a single line, let alone a single scene, which you can clearly ascribe to a Shakespearean model. But had Bengali theatre not grown familiar with Shakespeare, those plays would not have been written. See, I mean, the real contribution of Shakespeare to the traditional Bengali theatre of that period was not, I think, in the direct textual transmission, but transmission of content, but in providing a formal model which could intermesh so closely and reinforce the existing model, the traditional model of Bengali drama, namely the Jatra. I mean, Utpal Datta first pointed out the link between Shakespeare and the Jatra, but I'm not even sure he was the first to do so explicitly. I think Girish Chandra has some remarks on this remark and so on the subject, and so maybe to others. But even if Utpal Datta was the first person to note this explicitly, I repeat, I'm not sure he was certainly not the first person to have made use of this this connection. And I think what Shakespeare does to Bengali theatre in the later part of the 19th century is that it adds a new charge of maybe more close-knit dramatic structure, and certainly of a rhetorical and poetic model, a much more intensive poetic model than would obtain in the traditional Jatra texts. See? So that it was this kind of new amalgam of a dramatic form in which Shakespeare provides a crucial input, as it were. So, in that greater sense, Bengali drama from the mid-19th to the early 20th century is very deeply Shakespearean, and yet it is quintessentially Bengali at the same time. Okay. And this is, I think, a very remarkable synthesis. And I don't know how many such close syntheses there are in other non-Anglophone languages in the world. If there are any, maybe in a few other Indian languages, as Paromita was saying, Marathi, Kannada, Tamil. And in fact, not a language maybe you think of so closely, Gujarati. The first Indian language adaptation of any Shakespeare play to be acted on the commercial stage was in fact in Gujarati, version of The Taming of the Shrew. So there may be other Indian parallels, almost certainly are, which again need to be worked out, and maybe they have been worked out by researchers, and it's our ignorance that we don't know of them.
Thank you, Sukanta. This is also, the note that you ended on is also quite it's an interesting we can take off from there and talk a little bit about future directions this project might take.
Well, one of the things we've been trying to do for a while now is to think hard and long about, the term Bengal itself, and sort of interpret it in sort of a larger sense than just, negotiations with Shakespeare in West Bengal. But to think of definitely sort of doing some collaborative work with Bangladeshi universities. And we've started it, and we've, in fact, for our pedagogy stream, we've been interviewing Bangladeshi academics about, their experiences. So we've interviewed somebody from Khulna University, a couple of people from Dhaka, etc. And there is a sort of huge archive out there which really needs to be plumbed. So, and also to think about regions beyond, political demarcations, and think about regions in cultural terms, linguistic terms, geographical contiguity. So not getting too embroiled in political boundaries, and also because the colonial period definitely Bengal extended parts of Bihar, UP, Assam, definitely Orissa. So and we definitely, many of the Assamese translations, of course, we don't read the script, but of course, when we hear it, as Bengalis, we understand it. So, again, and also to think of the diaspora. So thinking of the Bengali diaspora, particularly in the West, as well as nationally in other cities. So we've been these are small ambitions. So hopefully we are going to extend the project in these terms. But if Shukanta.
Doyeeta, you are yourself very much a part of this project.
Yeah.
Would you,
and you are the future of the project. I'm not here for long.
No, we've been thinking about, as Paromita said, looking at Bangladeshi, but to interpret Bengal in the broadest possible term, look at those, sort of continue the project, and also sort of going back to what Chaudhuri said, to bring possibly kind of put together a larger sample of the stuff that we have, because we really struggled narrowing it down. We could not accord, even though we spoke a lot about pedagogy, we could not accord enough space. We could not do justice to it within 2 panels, so that was also one of the things, maybe a separate exhibition or separate showcasing of our findings on pedagogy altogether, Shakespeare teaching methods, either side of the border, also maybe other parts of the country.
And look at also how Shakespeare can start many of these conversations across borders, and and look at continuities of culture and histories.
So,
So at the Folger, like I say, we're looking at this both as something that's good in itself and also an experiment because it's a big world and the Folger is a relatively small institution, although we do a lot with comparatively little. But we need, if we're going to tell the story of Shakespeare in the world, we need partnerships with people who are interested in doing things like this. So as the relationship continues, we're certainly interested in seeing how it goes and seeing how we can replicate it in other parts of the world. And so far, so good.
Thank you. I think we're nearly out of time, so we have some time for questions from the audience, if you.
It seems slightly named.
I'm loud. Number one is there are 2 points. One is the Shakespeare attitude in Bengal. How was it helped by the Bengali translations of Shakespeare plays that were we used to read on a kid days? I think that was available amply, all in original names, not Bengali Bhranti Bilas like thing, comedy of errors and all that. Those translations, like Japanese comics Eric talked about, so those were there in class 4, 5, 6. People were reading, and how that helped. I think Kaushik is here, he can respond. That has it, because ultimately in 70s turbulent period, Utpal Babu wrote his Shakespeare Samaj Chetana, that Professor Chaudhuri has rightly pointed out is one of the most, that time it was very popular because people was trying to understand how a person who was born about 500 years back at the time of no internet becomes so endearing and enduring, not only in Bengal but all parts of the world. Mind it, that is a big question, philosophical, moral, whatever way you can tell it. Hyder was made, Paromita forgot to mention it, but probably Hyder was made the backdrop of Kashmir. Yeah, yes. Yeah, Julfikar, right, anyway. Now we are talking about all India scenario also. So this is, one thing is this, did it have any effect? I mean, eminent scholars teaching with performance in their classes. Did the vernacular books did have any effect? Has it a role in your projects? That is the thing.
In fact, we've tried to collect some of these books, especially books meant for young adults, like you're mentioning, and for children. And in the exhibition actually tries to showcase some of the illustrations of these books. And as you mentioned, these books in Bangla actually use the Shakespearean titles. And I think Sukanta mentioned about translations, a lamb's tales kind of versions of the plays, which still circulate widely. So we've been trying to actually collect some of these books and showcase some of those illustrations, yes. And I think it is quite important.
And there were, not just for children or young adults, but there were these 2 complete translations of Shakespeare, all the plays, which circulated very widely. One done by the Boshopati Sahitya Mandir, along with so many other of the publications. And a later one, the plays were translated by Ashok Guho. Those also had a very wide circulation at one point. Apart from that, there were other attempts. And this may be the point to mention a related factor, which is that there were various sort of Shakespeare societies of an academic rather than a theatrical nature, which were more than one, of at least 2, which were set up in the 20th century. One right at the start of the 20th century, 1901, which was actually called the Shakespeare Society of Bengal or something similar. And then later on, the Bengali, Shakespeare Sahitya Parishad. And they actually laid down guidelines for the translation of Shakespeare in Bengali. And these were followed For instance, in a translation of Macbeth done by one of the illustrious professors of English of the time, Nirendranath Rai, who used to teach at Bongabashi College. I recently came across this because I was editing the Bengali literary works of Ranajit Guha, whom we know chiefly as a social scientist, but he was also a considerable literary critic. And early in his life, he wrote a review of Nirendranath Rai's translation of Macbeth on these principles laid down by this Porishad. And Ranajit Guha sort of tore the translation to pieces, very unfairly, in my view, with some of the the enthusiasm of youth, which Ranajit Guha enjoyed at that point of his life. But there was a great deal of traffic going on. You see, I mean, everything from the highly academic tradition, which we associate too exclusively with Presidency College. There were a number of notable pieces of Shakespeare and of English literature generally in several other colleges in Kolkata at the time, and in Calcutta University. But that apart, a considerable reading public who were reading the plays, the full text of the plays in translation, either in dramatic form or in a prose paraphrase, but in full. See, the Macbeth Kohilen, Dedi Macbeth Uttare Bolilen, but you'd get the full text that way. This was they were books bought and read on a large scale. And this linking up with the theatre with these varying degrees, graded degrees of adaptation that I'm talking about. You had a whole spectrum. See, that is what is, I think, interesting. And I agree with Paromita, nothing like this exists at the present day. You see, this is not necessarily a value judgment, culture has changed, but it's just a sort of descriptive observation, as a record of the way things are. I think that is true today. You see, Shakespeare does not loom as large in our sort of cultural life as he seems to have done even 70 or 80 years ago, let alone 100 years ago.
Thanks. Are there any other questions?
Hi, if you don't mind, I'd like to ask a very non-academic question. So for all of you, what is your favorite Bengali adaptation of a Shakespeare play? Bonus points if it's streamable on Netflix.
Film or theatre?
Film.
For me, continues to be Shaptabudi. Also because, I should explain why. I'm a critic, I have to explain why. Because it's based on a literary text by Tara Shankar, who is actually using the Othello narrative and reinterpreting it in very important ways. And the play itself continues to be an abiding presence, which is the lens through which you need to read that narrative. So it's a very complex use of Othello. So, yeah.
I'm going to postpone that question because I'm about to be handed a stack of Bengali DVDs, so I'll do some homework and get back to you.
Next time. It's a question that needs a lot of diplomacy to it. But I would probably say Arshinagar. I think it does very interesting things with the text of Shakespeare. First of all, I think there's a bonus which you get with Arshinagar, which almost by definition you normally don't get in an adaptation of Shakespeare in another language, which is that the entire dialogue is in verse. Okay? This it's not exactly precisely Shakespearean verse, which is maybe just as well, because an exact equivalent of Shakespearean verse just would not work in the 2017 or 16, I think, when it was 15, yeah, when it was produced. But it's there. That's a dimension, and then the extension of what is basically a love story and the story of the animosity between two families, now extended to include an entire society. And the tensions, the oppositions, the state of an entire society reflected in a single relationship of two young individuals, and how in fact it impinges on their the outcome of their relationship. I think these are and also that very interesting sort of experimental fusion of many elements of stage presentation with the cinematic form. I think from a formal point of view, that seems to be interesting. And well, seeing that the basis is in a play meant for the stage. See, this is an interesting formal experimentation, I think.
Should we, if there are no other questions, like to thank our panelists and conclude our discussion today. Thank you for coming. If you haven't seen the exhibition, yeah, it is on till 17th, which is the Sunday. So if you haven't seen it, then the usual museum hours, I think, from 10 to 6.
10 to 6, Tuesday to Friday, and on the weekend till 8 o'clock, 10 to 8. Yeah. Thank you very much, everybody, all the panelists over there. I would like to suggest that you can continue discussing Chai Pe Shakespeare Charcha outside. Yeah.